The following video will contain spoilers for The Last of Us. Be warned. More than anything, The Last of Us is a story of trust and survival. Its world, one already split at the seams, spilling the rules and superficiality of its previous society onto the moss-ridden streets, is one that beckons for its inhabitants to build trust, break each other, in order to survive. The world has fallen into anarchy, and two survivors, through unfortunate circumstances, a surplus in this world, are forced to form an unbreakable bond, at the cost of everyone else. As a game, The Last of Us marks the beginning of a trend, where cinematics and immersion is conflated with tedium, but these road bumps don't prevent a return to the game being as easy as it gets. But I don't need to explain what The Last of Us is. Its popularity eclipses itself. Last of Us fans might be deadlier than a clicker, and its detractors might be more detestable than the bandits that roam the streets, but the extremity of both sides alludes to a brain rot poetically similar to the threats the characters face. This won't be an argument for the hailing of the game, nor will it be a call for its director's head. It'll be a reflection, an interpretation, nothing more. If I were a foolish man, I'd ask that the comments stay civil, but I know better now. With a game such as this, I'd avoid it entirely. I felt that The Last of Us Part 1 is a game that deserves its review scores. It deserves its praises. Maybe it doesn't deserve to be remade once every few years, but it's hard to go back to the original when the remake looks this good. I'll speak more on this later, but for now, I want to acknowledge that this video will be based off of the remake, which while in some ways is redundant, is regardless the best way to play the game. It's not often a game looks better not just than its original release, but better than the original as viewed through a nostalgic rose-tinted lens. It not only heightens the emotional scenes, but it heightens the tension too. Lurking in the shadows are nightmarish creatures, and The Last of Us, while never being a full-on horror game, doesn't mind dipping its toes into the water. As always with these videos, I won't stray away from spooky tones or imagery, but there will be no jump scares throughout the entire video, and if for some reason it is explicitly necessary, there will be text on screen like this, indicating when it's coming. Without further ado, The Last of Us Part 1 has received so much coverage over the years that I worry it may be impossible to provide a new perspective on it. I hope that I still can bring a new perspective to the game, and at minimum, explain how it spoke to me. Because this game did speak to me. It made me cry, it left me stunned at its beauty, and it left me, more than anything, understanding. I now understand why others love this game, and despite the issues I may have, I do too. The most important thing to note about The Last of Us 1 is that it is such a narrative-focused game that I cannot discuss it as I have other games. Splitting my commentary into categories of presentation and gameplay would do a disservice to the way Naughty Dog has allowed so much of their gameplay elements to support and tell the story of Joel and Ellie. The world of The Last of Us is where the most impressive story is told. Its opening showcases a homey environment. Sarah's weight distorts the couch with impressive detail, and her sassy dialogue draws an immediate parallel to Ellie. At first I thought this parallel was thin. I mean, sure, there are similarities, but the sharper edge to Ellie's tone is as much a character difference as it is an environmental difference. Sarah's concerns were not missing her favorite show and keeping up with her homework. Ellie's concerns are survival. Perhaps these two are more alike than I thought, but it's their environment that molds them to be so different. Said environment communicates everything we need to know about what happened between the game's cold open and when we see Joel 20 years later. We can see the state of the quarantine zones and the dynamic conversations, which if we hang around, will even include Joel. Our world is in a constant battle with nature. One side can never truly win. Every burnt down house will one day rebuilt, and every chopped down tree will eventually be cut down once more. The cordyceps, the fungal virus turning people into those things, is nature's way of taking its land back. In the same way the lumbered trees serve to build structures for humans, those same structures now offer a means for moss to reach higher, and for the flourishing flora to grow again. It's this battle, one we're losing, that makes the game so beautiful and so horrifying. These themes baked into the game's design are covered extensively in the documentaries for this game's production, and credit where it's due, I love that Naughty Dog included these, because watching them offers more context to the game's world, and the intentions of the character decisions. I'll be referencing it a few times in this video, and I highly recommend you watch them if you haven't already. It's gorgeous seeing a park, a designated cage for nature to grow, being completely taken back, now inhabited by the rest of the world. And the tranquility offered by a world at peace in its return to nature is contrasted by our fear of returning to nature. For us, nature winning this war was not just a loss of luxury, power, plumbing, production, but it's the loss of life. When we die, our bodies return to the earth in some way. Our matter isn't destroyed, we simply take another form. That's what's scary. We lose our humanity. We become part of a world that simply is. As a person is more and more ravaged by the infection as our eyes glaze over, eventually sprouting the cordyceps like flowers blooming out of their skin, they collapse into their environment. Their bodies break down, transforming into veins and spores that paint the walls. If it weren't at one point human, it would be beautiful, and maybe it still is. Seeing the way the world has changed and the way once civilized men were reduced to bandits, cannibals, Makes me wonder if perhaps they're deserving of such a fate. Even with the benefits and luxury of the world before, we still killed each other. We still wanted more, and our greed was never satiated. Maybe this is what we all deserved. We have become a species more content with destroying the world than we are with sharing it. But this is all on a macro level. The nations, corporations, and organizations are often what commit these deeds. But at the micro level, the individual in their day-to-day lives are still constantly trying not to lose themselves. Nature is unthinking. It simply is. This system, the pre-infection society, saw many in a system that simply was. Losing yourself in the modern day is losing your personality and becoming a drone. We don't want to be just another person. We want to be an individual. We want to be unique, and we don't want to simply exist or simply be. In a post-cordyceps world, infection isn't just certain death, but maybe it's the death of the self. We lose our control, we return to nature, we become that drone. We become a zombie. Maybe Sarah and Ellie aren't so different. Maybe it's not a loss, but a release. For some, infection is the final moment to reflect and wonder what's really going to happen to them. Will they be conscious of the transformation? Will they know that their anger and aggression is the product of a virus? Will they be peering at the world chained by the virus as they witness their bodies devouring their loved ones? Sam has to figure this out before he turns. He wonders, do the infected go to heaven when they turn? When do they die? Are they responsible? The game never answers this, and that furthers the fear of the cordyceps. They're a complete unknown and are still relatively new. They can't find hope in the government. After 20 years, the inaction alone is enough to picture the world's greatest minds throwing their hands up and shrugging their shoulders. Not only that, even if it is necessary, it's difficult to not resent the same people who are executing infected in the streets. Their only hope is the fireflies. The fireflies throughout the game felt like a holy figure. We find their markings on the walls, dog tags from former members, and glimpses of their presence are everywhere. It's never shown if these are left by members as a means of propaganda, or if it's a call-out from desperate survivors, a way of showing their faith. We rarely actually meet the fireflies aside from Marlene. We never see their camp, we're only assured that it exists. We only meet others in search of them, and when we do find where they should be, it's a ghost town. All that's left is their failures in finding a cure. The fireflies generally are shown to be a ragtag crew. When we first find Marlene, she's nearly dead. Not the best for raising our spirits. And when we do make it to the hospital, they mirror the antagonist from the intro too well. Sarah's death was caused by soldiers ordered to execute both her and Joel. The fireflies are ordered to knock them both out, and eventually they too plan to execute her. I believe this was intentional. When we can't help but see the way the fireflies treat Joel, we can't help but sympathize with his choice. I want to tackle Joel's decision later, but it is true that the fireflies are never portrayed in the best light when we see them. But their scarcity is what makes them such an idealized group. We fill in the blanks. We assume they're greater than a group of outlaws. When we hear that they're at a university, we make the connections to scholars, sophisticated work. And this is furthered more when we hear that they've relocated to a hospital. It's only once we're there that the walls break down. We realize that the group could barely figure out what to do with Ellie because they never thought they'd have the chance. And that's all it is. The cure isn't a guarantee. Even if a cure were to be developed, dispersing a vaccine from an outlaw group would be its own crapshoot. It's even further hard to imagine a cure being in sight because people can barely get by. No shirt is without tears, no streets without bodies. The environmental design of the world of The Last of Us is so impressive because it shows more than it tells. Finding a safe on the back of a truck stuck in the middle of a town implies that the people of opportunity saw in the chaos a chance to get ahead. The weeds growing in between the cracks imply that general landscaping has dropped severely low on the priority list. The insides of quarantine zones offer something close to a normal life, but the real collapse is outside. People found homes in sewers, discrete areas, and buildings that once housed corporations are now rotting corpses, full of rotting corpses. Despite the uncanny beauty of the different cordyceps, they are, regardless, monsters. They are all lethal, clickers being able to take you down in one hit, but what makes them complicated is that they require resources. A zombie isn't very threatening when you can carry a pound of lead in your back pocket, and that's where The Last of Us, like many of its contemporaries, aims to create fear, in restricting your agency. This is especially present during the first playthrough, which is that you can use a bullet to take down an enemy now, but what if you need it later? You can use the shiv to open this door, but what if you need to take down a clicker silently? Every resource in the game has a defensive and offensive use. You can only hold so much of each resource too, so choices in crafting are always made. I believe this is why the crafting is present here. It forces a meaningful decision. There are plenty of crafting systems where they only serve as a means to provide materials for the player to collect. But in The Last of Us, if you have blades and duct tape, you can craft a shiv, useful for taking down an enemy up close, or a bomb that can be used to take out multiple enemies at once, at range, but at the risk of alerting everyone nearby. Even further in this, again, do you use the shiv to take down an enemy, save it so you can turn the tides, or use it to open locked doors? Do you use the cloth to make a med kit or a Molotov? There's a consistent choice to be made, and you'll be constantly analyzing your inventory to determine if you can afford to craft one thing over another, or if you have enough bullets to justify the med kit over the Molotov. Another reason these decisions are important is because it decides your agency. If you do opt for a grenade over a shiv and you don't have any shivs, clickers are all the more deadly. They can hear you unless you walk as slowly as possible, and if you're caught, then you will die the moment they catch you. A shiv allows you to take one down. It allows you to create opportunities. Without one, opportunities need to be found. Openings need to be discovered, and in some cases you need to take the louder and riskier approach. Encounters without proper resources are encounters where you're not in control, and that's scary. This will be especially noticeable in the early game as resources are limited, and you're grappling with the new systems. Listen mode allows you to, only when near stationary, see where enemies are through walls, but only when they make a significant amount of noise. Some enemies like the stalkers are quiet enough to not be heard in listen mode, but their steps can still be heard if you listen closely, making this a more entertaining creature to encounter. Stealth against humans is just as complicated, and the AI in the game is something deserving of praise. You know, they say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting things to change, but what's really insane is that things do change. When I was stuck on a stealth encounter and took the same route over and over, I realized that enemies approached me from different angles, in different groups, and took different times to get there. Every time I replayed a stealth segment, things would go a different way, and it removed the punishment of death, making this one of the most fun stealth games I've played in a while. I love stealth games, but I always hated long segments because if I died, the punishment was a loss of time. Now I have to redo the first 2/3 of an encounter that I've already demonstrated I can achieve before I'm allowed to attempt the newer, often harder segment. Now with each encounter going a different way, each time I fail, it means I'm never stuck in monotony. My goal and tools are the same, but it's the challenge that changes, and I'm always challenged in a different way. And this is something that, while not easy, it's clear that the AI systems like this are beyond complicated. I would love to see standardized. I won't pretend like The Last is the first or even the best to do these things mentioned, but what matters is it's done well here. This applies to much more than the stealth too. As any seasoned Uncharted fan will see parallels between the projects that go much deeper than gameplay being a cinematic supplement to the story. Joel moves slowly, he climbs slowly, and this is one of the many ways we convey his age. Reality is, Joel's in his 50s. He can't move like he used to, and it makes guns more valuable because it's not as if he can just knock out hordes of infected. His movement is rigid, we can't go prone like the next game would allow, and at first I missed this feature, but I realized that while updating the gameplay in this way might help the gameplay loop, it would sour the immersion, and the game is fundamentally not designed for it. This is a slow game, and that needs to be factored into your playstyle, especially the shooting. Open gunfights are tense for the same reason stealth is, and that's because of an initial lack of agency. When you don't have the tools needed, the enemies will be pressuring you from all sides, and when ammo is scarce, every shot needs to count. You can't simply unload a whole mag into someone, you need to go for the head where possible, but there comes a disconnect when Joel's aim is significantly worse than my own. I need to preface this by saying, I haven't used a controller in a while, I only recently started playing more shooters on it, so there's always a skill issue rebuttal hiding around the corner, but man, the weapon sway in this game is downright annoying. Fortunately, you can spend supplements to get rid of the weapon sway, but especially in the early game, I would make a plan, and as I attempted to execute it, I would be halted by Joel shaking like he hasn't had his morning beer. After a few hours when shooting became tighter, it was so good, and the restrictions on ammo forced me to analyze my environment more. Instead of wasting a bullet on someone, I could throw a brick or a bottle at them to confirm a melee takedown. Granted, melee takedowns do take a while, and there were plenty of times where I died or got spotted because I spent too long taking someone down, which is once again a result of Joel's age. I feel like I might be presenting Joel as a few birthdays away from a Cain, and it's not that he isn't capable, he is. We consistently see the brutality and horror that Joel is capable of, but it's that he's stiff, and this is most felt when playing as Ellie. Ellie's movement is tight, it's fast. Where Joel struggles to vault with much speed, Ellie scrambles over in a flash. This makes the moments where we play as Ellie highlights because not only can the game impose more restrictions, her added mobility and switchblade mean her gameplay feels fundamentally different. In a narrative sense, this highlights Joel's age and Ellie's youth, but it also highlights Joel's influence on Ellie. Granted, this may not have been intentional, but I appreciated that Ellie learns from Joel. She has the same listening skills, though not as refined as Joel's, and she even puts her pistol in the back of her waist, just like Joel. It's also in this segment where we get a rare occurrence, a boss fight. Boss fights often don't work in The Last of Us because what makes the gameplay special is already present in the moment-to-moment encounters. A good boss fight for me is one that tests the skills you've learned up to that point. This means testing your resource management, your stealth abilities, your aim, but all of these things are already tested at the same time in gameplay. You could call an encounter like the Bloater's mini-bosses, and if that be the case, I'd argue that they aren't all that fun, because the game, in order to not have the player too ill-equipped, ensures they have plenty of tools to get through the fight, meaning I didn't have to manage my resources much at all, and aiming wasn't as hard because it's a huge enemy that moves slowly. I quickly fell into a loop of running away, doing damage until it got close, and repeating. But the fight against David was done exceptionally well because it was a test that limited your tools for you. Again, a virtue of playing as Ellie. My favorite part of the fight was when David himself starts using stealth, meaning our hearing doesn't work against him. I wish this phase lasted longer, but I could also understand that at this point for some, the fight may have been leaning towards being repetitive. Much of Ellie's chapter is spent in combat, but as Joel, while encounters will be plenty, just as much time will be spent exploring and solving puzzles. While exploring was engaging in the sense I was always discovering something useful or interesting, I wasn't as impressed with the puzzles. In the early hours of the game, puzzles go like this. Ellie needs to get across some water, so you'll need to find a pallet for her to jump on so you can carry her across. An object needs to be pushed so the two can get over an obstacle. A generator needs to be powered on to open a door. The issue with this is that I lied. They actually take place throughout the entire game and do not ramp up in complexity or scale for that matter. In many cases, they only ramp up in tedium. In one case, we had a ladder that needed to be used on the other side of a gap, and the solution was to climb up to a higher walkway with the ladder, pull the ladder up to us, use the ladder to come down, grab the ladder, and use the ladder one final time. This is tedious. I understand with Joel's age, I shouldn't and honestly don't expect him to jump the gap, but when the time it takes to execute the solution far exceeds the time taken to think of the solution, then I feel like my time isn't valued. And yes, I understand the irony in that statement given the length of this video. Some puzzles were also not intuitive. For example, when exiting the university, there was a generator that needed to be moved into position, and we do this by wheeling it to the power source. Now there's a circle around the cord indicating that it can be interacted with, and that cord obviously has some length, so I assume that we need to put the generator in position, walk over to the generator, grab the cord, and plug it in. I am not kidding when I say I could not figure this out for the life of me, and eventually gave up, searching YouTube for the answer. The solution was to park the generator in front of the power source, causing Joel to automatically plug it in. The reason I was preconditioned to believe that this wouldn't be the answer is because at every stage up to this point, the game insisted that you take the most tedious route. This was further reinforced in Left Behind, because despite taking place after the point in which Tommy gives the tube a tool to siphon gas, when looking for said gas, I assumed Ellie would already have it and use it, but instead the game forced us to find a new siphoning tool, which again, isn't that big of a deal, but it conditioned me to expect solutions to be as tedious as possible. Now granted, I may have just been suffering some brain rot here, because it took more than 15 minutes to find the siphon, and the funniest part is, it was highlighted in yellow. It was in the one spot I didn't check, and as of writing, there's been a lot of discussion spurred on by a tweet that was critical of the way games will just have yellow or white paint on certain ledges or objects to indicate that the object is to be interacted with in some way. While I agree that there are more immersive ways of doing this, I always considered the ropes on a ledge in Far Cry 4 as a good compromise. I must also admit that based on this issue, I'm the idiot that needs the yellow paint. To focus a bit more on Left Behind, what the expansion showcases more than anything is that Naughty Dog's winning companion formula carries a lot of the monotony in gameplay. The issues stated above with the puzzles were never too obvious because we had constant conversations between Ellie and Joel. Even if I was doing something as boring as carrying a ladder up and down a ledge, I was learning about the characters, or at least seeing their relationship evolve. This is another element of Uncharted that carries over, but what Left Behind does well is that, by now placing you alone, you feel more vulnerable. In the main game, Ellie will point out enemies, shoot enemies, point to loot, but when you're alone, you can be snuck up on. You don't have a safety net, and the silence is deafening. There were some parts of the game, especially when you're alone, that were genuinely scary. The fear I felt in The Last of Us was my favorite kind of fear. Personally, I have no respect for jump scares, because the scare itself doesn't need to terrify me in any way, it just needs to startle me. Throw up a picture of Fortnite and add screams in the middle of a video and I'll jump. But what did you achieve with this? The other form of fear is in the atmosphere, creating an environment where you don't feel welcome, where you feel watched, where you feel vulnerable. This is how Arkham Asylum, a non-horror game, can be scary at times. Rocksteady did an excellent job of making us feel as though being within the asylum was like being within the belly of the beast, and a beast that isn't happy with our presence. The Last of Us puts us in a world where, again, nature is in control, and we feel like strangers in a land unwelcome to us. The final form fear takes is in immersion and fear of what's real. There are some people that don't find games scary because games aren't real, and whatever horrors within a game are bound by the four walls of a television. But consequences within a game, dying, losing progress, that's real, tangible, and it's something the players don't want. Couple this with how well The Last of Us immerses me in the world, the characters, and makes me want the best for these characters, and we get in-game fears. I don't want Joel to die, and I know how fragile he is, and when clickers are as deadly as they are, the tension that builds as we have to slowly walk past them, praying they don't hear us, is some of my favorite horror-esque elements. The connection we feel to Joel and Ellie is one the game spends the whole runtime working towards, and the only way the final chapter can succeed is if we not only care deeply about Ellie, but parallel Joel. The entire game we're pushed along the same track that Joel's mind runs on, mostly. Joel is immediately set up as a tragic tragic character, but also as one that's willing to make difficult choices. When the Coopers are infected and they invade the Miller residence, Joel doesn't hesitate much to protect his daughter, even at the cost of her horror. Her reaction is encapsulated in a single line: "We saw them this morning." This is a reflection of how the infected were still humanized. They weren't infected. The question was still being asked: why are people doing this? By the time we take control of Joel again, they aren't people anymore. Sarah's eventual death was surprisingly hard-hitting. I was already on her side because I empathized with the idea of a kid's life being shattered in an evening, and her death, the way she speaks, it almost moved me to tears, especially when you know the same scenario is doomed to repeat itself. Joel's wife died when Sarah was young, and when we see Joel again, Tessa's there, and it's never confirmed if the two are a couple. I know they're a couple in the TV show, but the TV show does make a few changes, so I don't want to use it as a means of informing the game too much. What I did notice right away is the way Joel scolds and attempts to patch up Tess when she arrives, like he's still a father all this time later. Maybe it speaks to the way that Tess is filling a Sarah-sized void in his heart. Maybe it speaks to how protective Joel is of those close to him. It doesn't matter much, because Tess goes quickly. Tess's attitude changes significantly once she's bitten. She goes from talking about laying low and thinking of the future to just getting through the day. We see something similar in Sam. Being bitten offers a kind of clarity that can only be found in tragedy. Suddenly nothing matters anymore. What do? It's over. In a world where a death sentence is around every corner, how do you plan for the future? How do you get excited, work towards, anticipate a future that you likely won't see? People today struggle with the same thing. Our world is full of luxuries, but it's also full of death, destruction, and so much uncertainty. I'm supposed to plan for retirement? I don't know how the fuck I'm gonna make it to 25. People lay awake at night, stuck with the same vision of everything crumbling. All it takes is one stroke of bad luck for everything to come undone. How do you live like that? In Ellie's case, when she finds out she's infected, she chooses to wait it out, let nature take its course, and yet she doesn't turn. What then? The world is in a constant state of surviving for the sake of it. Bill, despite offering solid comic relief, is surviving for the sake of it. What are his goals? He doesn't want to leave. He's content consuming his vintage pre-apocalypse media. The reason Tommy's camp is so enticing is because it's a slice of the world where Joel can go back to living for more than to keep living. Joel doesn't have anyone. Even his brother left him. That's where Joel and Ellie connect at first. They both have no one. When we first meet Ellie, she's standoffish to Joel, who reciprocates, and it's hard to not understand that. But once everything is explained, I believe Joel realizes that this is the purpose he was searching for. This is something worth fighting for, and Ellie knows this too. That's why she went to the Fireflies. But again, all we've seen by this point is that the Fireflies are barely keeping things together. It's at this point that the game gets into its second act, and we see the evolving dynamic between two people who aren't sure if they want to, or can, get attached to another person. Joel knows that everyone he has gotten attached to has died, and this is especially fresh after Tessa's death. Ellie's in the same place, but she's willing to move forward with Joel, who does what he can to keep her at arm's length, pushing further away the more Ellie asks about his past. The player aligns with both characters in that everyone we meet throughout the game, aside from Tommy, either dies or leaves us, but Ellie and Joel don't. Marlene's gone after the opening, Tess dies, Sam and Henry die right as we get comfortable with them, Henry specifically taking his own life. Out of grief or out of guilt, it's not clear. Having to shoot your own brother, who's effectively become a son to you, has to put you under a severe amount of stress. When we look at Henry and Sam as a copy of Joel and Ellie, then we see Sam was likely Henry's reason to keep going. This world is cruel, and the journey to the Fireflies for them is a chance to do something more, achieve something greater for themselves. When Sam turns, Henry has no one, no reason to keep going. If he can't keep going for himself, survive for the sake of survival, well, now imagine how Joel might react. Joel consistently takes a rigid, out-of-sight, out-of-mind approach to grief. When faced with trauma, there are different ways people accept it, and I really dislike the word accept because it implies this kind of peace that often isn't the case. When something unfortunate has happened to myself in the past, I can confront it. I can accept that it happened, but I can't be at peace with its ramifications. I still ask why. I can never be at peace with the idea that sometimes shit happens, and that goes doubly for any situation comparable to Joel's. Joel's decision to just not think about it makes sense, especially when there is no logical reason behind it. Joel couldn't have been more prepared. He couldn't have saved Sarah. It was out of his hands, and yet he's the one who carries it. It doesn't stop Joel's harsh exterior from being frustrating. He could build a home out of the olive branches he's broken, but it does rationalize it. I believe this is imperative to the story because the ending decision hinges on not agreeing with Joel, but understanding him. He's the main character, but he's not the hero. Part of understanding Joel is, as mentioned, ensuring the player parallels his thinking. I think this is why we play as Ellie right before the final chapter. It's not only a means of mixing up the gameplay which flirted with monotony, but it also serves as a final catch-up. If you didn't care for Ellie before all of this, now you will. We get to see that she's capable of not only surviving on her own, but saving a character we've grown attached to. After all they've been through, they're a team, whether they like it or not, and Ellie's had too many people leave her or die for her to just let it happen again. Once they finally make it to the Fireflies, the parallels to the opening begin showing again. I appreciated that Joel asked Ellie if she really wants this. He's offering her a way out, and eventually, he won't give her the choice again. As mentioned, this final segment is intentionally similar to the opening for two reasons. We need Joel to be in the headspace to justify his decisions. He can't lose another daughter. And the second is that we need the player to see the writing on the walls, and not want it to happen again. We can see the writing on the walls literally too. The Firefly's logo, whenever we've seen it in the environment, is white, and this adds to the deity-esque presentation of the group. There is Snow White, cleansed from the sins of the world, but when we see their logo outside the operating room, it's red, as if the room it marks is one where great sins are going to take place. Now, on top of that being the first time my Sunday school education actually helped me in life, it reinforced this idea that we're saving Ellie, but are we? This is the decision that had entire videos made around it. Was Joel justified? I'd like to take the stance that he wasn't, but the reality is, there was never a choice. I don't believe there was any way that Joel would be convinced to let this happen to Ellie, and I think the game's argument is not that he is correct for doing this, but that it makes sense for him to do it. I want to compare this ending to another game's ending, Life is Strange, as an example of how to do this kind of ending poorly. I know it's fun to hate on this game, and even if I thought it was hella good, I think the ending, specifically one in which you chose to save Chloe, falls flat, and the reason is because the game didn't make me care enough for her. She's selfish throughout the game, she isn't worth dooming a whole town for, and as a player, I didn't find her enjoyable or charming enough to keep around. In Ellie's case, I wanted her to live. She deserved to live. When she runs off to the farmhouse, Joel and her have an argument that starts with her reading a diary. The power in this scene is Ellie's realization that her problems are so much bigger than they should be for anyone, let alone a 14-year-old. She deserves to struggle with juvenile relationships, deciding what to wear to the first day of school, and engaging in interests. She can have the life that Sarah never got. I want that for Ellie, and Joel does too, but this doesn't consider what Ellie wants. Ultimately, it's not as though Ellie didn't accept the surgery. She may not have had all the information, but let's suppose she did for a moment. Her life now has meaning. Her death has meaning. She already accepted she was going to die a few weeks before meeting Joel. If she turns down the surgery, where does she go? Back to Tommy's? Maybe that's her best hope at a normal life, but then I ask, is Tommy's camp one where life is normal, or is it a convincing performance? The Last of Us 2 answers this, but in the context of the game, the question isn't totally answered. If Ellie consciously denied the surgery, how long could she live with herself? She blames herself so much already. How long before she blames every death, every lost luxury, and every new infected on herself too? The real tragedy with Ellie is that she doesn't have a choice, and if she did make the choice, it was taken away from her. Joel is so dead set on finding his new normal that he's ready to slaughter hundreds in cold blood and take away the agency of a little girl. And you want to know the most horrifying part of it? He's content with that. How often does Joel smile in The Last of Us? It's not often, but during the epilogue, returning to Tommy's, he's beaming, ear to ear, with joy. He's going to return to a home, with a family, and I had the impression that he lost his mind. He just murdered a hospital, killed doctors capable of saving people, imploded the very individuals trying to save the world, and he's smiling. Joel's determination to survive is one mentioned throughout the story, but this is the first time we see not what he's physically capable of, but mentally capable of, and that's a whole different thing. I am capable physically of killing, but mentally I'm not. I could never pull the trigger. Hell, I've never actually struck someone unless it was in defense. We see Joel do similar. He kills only when he has no other choice. In one instance, when interrogating two men on Ellie's whereabouts, we get a glimpse into the things he had to do to survive, but still, this was done to cannibals and to save someone. This time, he has a choice, and he's killing strictly because he wants something. The moment that cemented Joel as the villain to me was when he said this:
"You just come after her."
I justified most of this segment in my head by saying that Joel was just seeing red. He's panicking, and in a world like this, he's reacting in the only way the last 20 years have taught him how to react. But this line, no. He knows what he's doing. That smile at the end. He probably compartmentalized his killing spree in his mind, right next to a cabinet labeled Sarah. He's a monster, and he's the villain. The entire world could have been saved, but he won't let it. Now, there is the argument that the Fireflies are too unsophisticated for a cure to really be possible, but I think the point of the ending was that he would have made the choice regardless. The problem isn't that he made the choice, it's that it wasn't one for him to make. This should have been Ellie's choice. She still gets some choice. Perhaps she could formulate a plan to reach the Fireflies again herself, assuming there are any doctors left. But Joel wouldn't let this happen. Ellie is the hero, she's the one capable of ending the infection, and Joel is the villain. His smile is one made in celebration of that victory. The game ends with Ellie asking Joel if what he said was true, and he lies right to her face. Ellie ends the game with a simple, okay, and we're left wondering even more. Was this an affirming, I believe you? Or was this a concession that even if he was lying, Joel wouldn't let it happen anyways? When I first played the game back in 2013, I hated this ending. I had so many questions without answers, like where do we go from now? The Last of Us 2 answers this quickly, but I want to save my discussion of part 2 2 for its own video. I think Part 2 gives a lot of context to the story, but it isn't really needed. There are some callbacks Part 2 makes that rewards people who paid attention, and I like that certain events, like David hunting down Joel and Ellie as revenge for their killing sprees, are situations that seem doomed to repeat themselves. With that said, I like that Part 2's answers don't take away from the ending here. It still has its power, and it remains one of the better stories I've played in a game. I touched on the major story beats that stood out to me, but I shouldn't forget to mention the moment-to-moment dialogue, which is great. It was always interesting seeing Ellie once again try to scale the walls Joel puts up, just as much as it is seeing her lost in the wonder of the world, as if for a split second, she gets to actually be a kid. This applies to generally every character like Henry, Sam, Tess. They all offer insights into how they see the world and how they're coping with the apocalypse. I thought the pacing was well done throughout, though I did find the structure of heading from one major landmark to the next to be both obvious and tiring. If I had one major criticism, it would be that I wanted more. The cliffhanger ending is as much a tantalizing tease for a potential sequel as it is an intentional beckon for subjective interpretation, but I still would have wanted more, and I guess that's a great problem to have. I think The Last of Us today is seen in a very different light than it was many years ago. The shift from seeing the game as a masterpiece to viewing it with a more skeptical lens is natural, and likely spurred on by the controversy surrounding Part 2. Especially now that we've had a decade to think about it, it's easier to see Part 1 as being overrated. At the time, when this released, it was one of the best looking games I played, and I loved it. I couldn't imagine games looking much better, and now with the remake, God. My point is, I expected my opinion to change with time, and it did, but I still find myself appreciating this game for what it is and what it communicates. I think there's an expectation here to present something deeper. You won't have to look far to see videos reaching past an hour analyzing the game and its story, but my enjoyment of the game was far simpler. I felt like everything this game did, it did well, in some cases really well. In terms of a remake, the PC performance was poor, but my playthrough was stable, and if you're presenting a remake that I sometimes forgot was designed for the PS3, I have to call that a success. I could go on about some of the finer details like the workbench animations that, despite being long, are just eye candy. Left Behind is a great DLC that further contextualizes the main game and further explains how Ellie was able to take care of Joel, but I don't have much to say about it given that the gameplay is so similar to the main game. I liked Riley and thought the bonding between the two was really sweet, and the ending, despite knowing it was coming, was tragic. I almost wish Left Behind was slotted into the main story because it explains why Ellie is going to such lengths to not lose another friend, though I understand that it might not be the best idea. Story-wise, it was great, and gameplay follows suit, and again, I wish I had more to say, but like the main game, simply put, I just get it. I understand the love this game gets. I tried doing some research and didn't find many scathing reviews of the game, and in fact, most of the negative discussion has been in the wake of Part 2's release, which seems to have made a wider impact on the series. Last of Us Part 2 was to some an excellent sequel to the game that never needed one, but to others, it soured the whole story. To them, it's impossible to appreciate the first game now that they know how it all turned out, and what happened to their favorite characters. I have to admit something. Until sitting down to cover the first game, I had never actually played The Last of Us Part 2. I had seen the cutscenes on a YouTube video, but a personal issue I tend to have is that if a game has a severe controversy, or in this case a controversial fanbase surrounding it, I'm totally put off from the product. I didn't want to play the second game because it gave me an easy way to not engage in the debates, especially when people's opinions on the game are being used to extrapolate real life opinions. For now, I can say with the utmost confidence that I liked The Last of Us Part 1. Is it in my top 10 of all time? No, but I really enjoyed it. As for my opinion on the second game, well, how much time do you have?